On a humid morning in June 1962, Puerto Cabello barely seemed to stir. The heat pressed down upon birdless skies and the muggy air carried not the usual sense of salt and diesel, but something sharper, a sense that the city waited for trouble. Puerto Cabello was a port, yes, but it was also an arsenal. Its towering warehouses hid generations of arms and desperate ambitions. Behind grim facades, the city's garrison watched and waited, caught between memories of authoritarian rule and the unpredictable new order clinging to power in Caracas. Lieutenant Manuel Ponte Rodriguez rose before dawn, his boots scuffing floors thick with the dust of rationed supplies and spent dreams. He paused to study the men who had gathered at the shadowed heart of Agustin Armerio barracks, 5 young officers burned by idealism, 4 sailors scarred by betrayal, and a scattering of civilians using false names scrawled on forged papers. Each face told him a different story: hunger for justice, thirst for vengeance, fear of what would come if the coup failed. At precisely 4 a.m., the city's old silence shattered. Ponte's men moved quickly, trained for stealth and violence. Ammunition depots fell with barely a whisper. The rebel group seized communications. 2 officers who refused to join, men Ponte had shared coffee with only days before, resisted and were executed. Their bodies were left where they fell, with red cloth laid over the insignia on their uniforms. There was no time for ceremony. This wasn't the revolution of dusty textbooks, it was expedient, improvised, and lethal. By sunrise, Soviet-made tanks and US-built jeeps rumbled through cobbled alleyways. Radios blared with rebel propaganda: "The city belongs to the people now." The voice echoed off closed windows, bouncing through empty plazas and shuttered storefronts. In the backstreets, the rebellion's more criminal face emerged. Stores were looted not for the cause but for old grudges, cigarettes, radios, and watches changed hands at gunpoint. Some, swept along by chaos, settled debts long left unpaid. In Caracas, the news traveled fast. President Romulo Betancourt, accustomed to hard choices, read the reports with no visible change in his expression. He delivered his verdict bluntly: the Air Force was to bomb rebel positions until Puerto Cabello surrendered fully. The message came without appeals to democracy, speeches about unity, or warnings of loss. It was an order written for history: regain control at all costs. By mid-morning, the city had become a battlefield. Bombs fell on familiar streets, painting over decades of conflict and commerce with new wounds. The docks, always restless, began to take on the aspect of a graveyard. The bodies of sailors washed to shore, their uniforms indistinguishable after hours in the salty foam. Thick plumes of smoke merged with morning mist, the very air seemed to mourn. By evening, the violence had ebbed, casualties swept away like storm debris. The government prevailed, but at great cost: the port was crippled, the population traumatized, and the official number dead an abstraction for the living. Most rebels surrendered, their leaders vanished, their names buried in classified archives. The survivors, both loyal and insurgent, carried away their memories in silence. For some, all that remained was shame; for others, the bitter taste of justice denied. In years to come, journalists and politicians would dust off the leftist rebellion label, turning Puerto Cabello into a battleground of ideology rather than memory. But those who survived the day spoke of gangs more than heroes, caution more than courage. They knew the difference between a revolution and an armed crime. The sea alone bore witness: each wave rolling toward the horizon carried away a story, a secret, a name unspoken. In the end, Puerto Cabello stood as living evidence that some revolutions don't end, they are simply rewritten, locked away within the files and forgotten corners of national memory.